Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of this tutorial. If you haven't seen part 1, it's in the top right of the screen right now and also in the description down below. Definitely make sure you go watch that. We kind of made our scene and orientated correctly to our actual footage. But today we're going to be doing some interacting with our footage. I have a hand. If we come over just to see this, I have my hand come over and we're going to basically push a bunch of particles off and they're going to interact with our actual chairs and fall on the floor like that. So anyways guys, let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, we need to actually define where our cube is going to be on the actual countertop. So if we come over here to wireframe so we can actually see our footage, we can scrub out here and we can see that our shadow kind of tells us where we're going to put our cube, and that it's going to be right here, which is in between these two chairs right here. And so that's going to be basically right here. So we just want to go ahead and add a cube. I'm just going to leave it on the default size like that. And then basically we just want to position that exactly where we saw it in the footage. Okay, so now that we actually have our cube where we want it in the scene, we can actually go ahead and play around with some of our particles. Now I actually have a add-on called the molecular script add-on. This basically allows our particles to interact with each other. In Blender by default, particles actually can't interact with each other. They can only interact with other objects, and so this script changes that, so we can actually do that. Again, if you want to install that, link is in the description below. And then when you have that downloaded, you just want to go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then hit the install button up here, and then just locate wherever you have that zip file downloaded. And then once you have that in, you should see we have this molecular add-on. You want to make sure that is checked like that. And so now we can actually make sure our cube is selected, come down to the bottom to the particle properties. We're just going to go ahead and name a new particle system. This time we want it to be on emitter, and then if we come to the wireframe view, you can see all of our particles like that. We actually want them to be in a grid pattern. These are just kind of random, and they're only spawning on the faces instead of the actual volume of the cube. So first we want all of the particles to actually spawn on the very first frame. So we can do that by heading the start and end frame, both set to 1. Like that. And so now over here you should see that all of our particles, if we scrub out, should be on frame 1, should be here like that. That is looking good. And we're also going to set our lifetime up to be 250, just so we have them existing throughout the whole clip. So that is looking good. Now to change them to be more like a grid pattern like we want, we can come down to the source section. From emit from, instead of faces like we have it on now, we're going to set it to volume. So now the actual things come out of the volume instead of the faces. And then the distribution, that's going to be where they actually spawn, how they spawn. And so right now we just have it on jittered, which is kind of a random effect, but we actually want it to be on grid like that. And so now let's go to the very first frame and see that, and that is looking much better. So now if we render out this animation, we won't actually see these particles, and that is because these particles are actually non-renderable. They're basically just for viewing purposes only. So we can just go ahead and add. We're going to add a mesh. Then I'm going to do icosphere. You can also do a UV sphere, but I'm just doing this so we have less geometry in our scene. Then over here I'm just gonna change the subdivisions down to 1, so we have a small little object like that. Now that we have this, let's just go ahead and move this out of the scene so we can't see it on the camera. This will be useful because we're actually going to be rendering these particles as the icosphere object. So we just want to come over here, select our cube again, and then going down into the render panel, we can render as, right now it's set to halo. This is what all these are, but instead we want to go to object, and then the instant object, we just want to select this little eyedropper tool and select our icosphere. And so now if we zoom in, we can actually see all of the little dots have been replaced with our actual object. So in this top view, we can see that all of these particles are kind of spaced out when we want them to be on top of each other like this. So first what we have to do is set the scale of our actual particles. And so for mine, I'm going to do a 0.4 like this, just so they're a little bit smaller. And you can see that that doesn't really affect the spacing at all. And so to change that, we're going to come over here and affect this resolution button. For mine, I'm going to set it to 32. I believe that is correct. Actually, I need to set it a little bit less. You can see that our particles are actually inside of each other when we don't really want that. So I'm just going to decrease that a bit. Until they're outside of each other. If you zoom in real quick, we can see that they are barely outside of each other. So now if I go ahead and give this a little play, we can see that our cube falls. So that is good. It is being affected by gravity. but we can see that it actually falls right through our table, and we don't want that. And so the way we're going to change that is to actually come over here, select this table, and then we need to add in a new physics property. We need the collision property to be enabled for the table right here. And so this will actually affect the particles now. We want to change the friction a bit. Instead of the soft body and cloth properties, we actually want to change the particle properties. It's nice that you can change those and be different from each other. So we just want to increase the friction all the way up, just like that. And so now if we come back here to the cube, go into wireframe and press play, we can actually see what's going on. So this is what I was talking about earlier. All the particles don't collide with each other, but in Blender by default there is no way you can actually have them colliding with each other unless you make them rigid bodies, and we don't really want to do that. And so with our molecular add-ons installed, we're just going to go back into the particle properties and actually going to come down here. You should see this molecular section. We're just going to check that. And then in the simulate, we're just going to set our start and end frame. Mine is just going to be 1 to 250. That is good. And then we can start this molecular simulation. That'll basically just start the simulation, but we don't want to do that yet. We want to play around with a little bit more settings. Down here in the density section, we can actually calculate the particles by weight. This will just give the actual particles weight, and so that will determine how the motion of the actual particles look. And so we're just going to hit this button real quick, and it gives us a custom. We can also change to one of these. For the sake of my tutorial, I'm just going to leave it on custom and change mine down to a 1 kilogram per cube meter. Next, this is the important section, is actually the collision section. This basically allows it to collide with other things and also itself. And so we just want to activate the self collision right here. If you have another particle system that you would want it to collide with as well, you can activate this right here, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're not going to really deal with that. So now that we have the self collision enabled, we can also come down here to the link section like this. And linking is basically how the particles are going to stick to each other. We don't want the particles to just fall like they are rigid bodies. We actually want them to stick together and then break apart whenever large force is put on them. And so we're going to activate that. And then you can also play around with some of these settings right here. We want initial linking at birth. This gives us a lot of options right here. You can set all these options, but we're not going to really deal around with any of this. The only thing that we do want to set is to actually add this. This is basically going to have a radius of each particle, and if another particle is within that radius, they're going to stick together. So you just want to basically play around with this based on what you're doing. For mine, I am going to do a 3. I find that that works for me, but if you're doing your own simulation, just kind of play around with that number and see which one works for you. One final thing I'm going to do is actually play around with the friction of this collision in the particle linking. I'm going to set the link friction to be up like this. To around a 0.4, I think, and then the self collision I'm just going to do a 2.5, just nice and simple like that. Now if we go ahead and start the molecular simulation, we should see that the actual molecules stay together and kind of act like jello, and this is what we want. So now that we have all these settings in our cube set up, we actually need to have our hand interacting with our cube, because right now that cube is doing nothing but just staying there, and we actually need to knock it off into the floor. So we're going to go ahead and free all the bakes like that. And then first, before we do the actual hand, we need to add collision to all these other objects, because right now if we just hit this off the table, this will pass through all of these objects right here. And so to do that, we're just going to select this, and bit by bit we're just going to hit collision, collision, collision. You're going to do these for all the objects in our scene. Okay, so now that we have all of our objects set to be collision, we can actually come up here and we're going to go ahead and add, I'm going to add another icosphere just to be our hand model like this. I'm going to come over here and then scale it in the X, just trying to model out a quick little hand shape like that. That is looking good right there. And then I'm just going to position this kind of back behind our cube. I think somewhere around here is going to be good. And so now we can go into the wireframe mode so we can actually see our hands. I'm going to go ahead and hide this just so we can view it a bit easier. But we're going to come out, see where our hand is. And then basically we're just going to hit G to move it, and then Shift X to move it only in the Z and Y direction, because we don't want it to move in our X axis like that, and position it where our hand is, and then we can add a location keyframe. And now we're going to actually make this easy on ourselves. Instead of having to hit I all the time, we can actually just come down here and have the auto keyframing on. And so now if we come throughout our clip, we're just going to again hit G, Shift X, position that where our hand is. Again, come out like this, G, Shift X, position to where the hand. And what's nice is that it's automatically creating our keyframes down here, and it's following our hand pretty nicely. We're just going to continue doing this. And so now if we come over here and view our animation, we should see that our actual icosphere follows our hand pretty well, and we didn't really have to do too much work. The final thing that we have to do to our icosphere to actually have it interacting with our little particles is to come over here and add a collision property to it as well. Okay, so now that we have that done, I'm going to go ahead and disable the auto keyframing so it doesn't mess us up later. But now we are actually ready to start our simulation. I'm just going to go ahead and hit Alt H to unhide our cube like that, and then we're just going to go to the first frame, and we can go back into the particle settings and just scroll all the way down here, and then go ahead and start the molecular simulation. Okay, so our simulation just finished, and let's take a look at it. We have it bouncing and then falling on the floor. That is looking good. If for any reason you don't like our actual simulation, I would recommend just playing around with some of these settings. Usually it's the weight of the actual particles, but also sometimes it's the friction of these, and then also the search length. So you just want to play around with those until you get a simulation you like, but we're going to go ahead and continue with this. So now if we come over here to our camera and then go into the render view, we can see all of these objects, which we actually don't want to see for our final render. So first things first, we're going to come over here to the render engine. We're going to change this to cycles. Then I'm going to set it to be GPU compute, then render down to 32. These are just all my basic settings I set up every time I want to actually render out something. For the light path section, we're just going to change all these down to 3. And then change the reflective and refractive caustics to off. And then finally, just going to come down here to the film, change that to transparent. Then performance, I'm going to set my tile size to be 512 by 512. This is because I'm rendering on a GPU. Also, we just want to double check that our color management is on Filmic instead of standard, so just come over here to Filmic like that. But we will notice that we still have all of these objects in our actual scene, and we don't want these. First of all, we actually have our cube in our scene, and so when we render that out, we'll actually see the cube. So we want to come over to the particle settings again. Going all the way up, we can actually go into this render settings over here, and then we have the show emitter. We actually don't want this emitter to be shown, so we can just uncheck that. We can still see it in this viewport, but when you actually render it out, we won't be able to see it. But now we can see that we only want the shadows of our actual objects right here, and so let's first of all change our actual lighting. And so we're just going to go into the wireframe view just to see where our shadows are. We can see that we have some shadows going kind of this way down to the left, so we're just going to mimic that real quick. Just going to go into rendered. We actually have a light in our scene that we're going to use for now. No HRIs in this tutorial, and so we're just going to kind of mimic that a bit. I think it was about right there. That is looking good. We will notice that we have a little too harsh of shadows, and so to change that, first of all, I'm just going to move that a little bit further away from the cube. And then going into the lighting section, we're going to change around the radius. If we change that up a bit, we can notice that we actually have some softer shadows like that. So that is looking good. And then finally, we're just going to come up to the power, and I'm going to increase that. Let's try a 2500. Let's see how that looks in our scene. Just trying to match that a little bit better. First of all, though, to actually view this a little bit easier, we need to create all these objects to be a shadow catcher. But basically that means it's going to be projecting the shadow only and not the actual surface of these objects that we have. And so to do that, we're just going to come over, select our objects, and then go into the object properties, visibility, and in here we can just set the mask to be a shadow catcher. And so now we only have the shadows rendering. We want to do these for all the objects, including this object up here. So shadow catcher. So yeah, you just want to do these for all of our objects in the scene besides our little particles. Again, you will still see that this is here, and that won't be rendered if we actually render. So now let's come back to the let's just go to a middle frame to see how the lighting is looking. Let's just render it out on this frame right here. So go up here, render out an image. Okay, so we get this image. There are two things wrong with this. Number one, we don't have the video in the background, so we need to composite that in. But also we can see that our actual icosphere is cutting this object in half, and that will basically make it look weird in our final render. So instead of just having it on the shadow catcher, we also need to disable it from our renders. And so there are two ways to do that. You can either uncheck mark this view in renders, or we can come up here and then hit this little icon right here, and this is just a more visual way to see that. So we just want to disable our icosphere from view and also our renders. Okay, so now that we have that, we're going to come up to the compositing section. We're going to hit use nodes, and this is the node setup we have now. We basically just have our render layers going out into our composite. I also have the node wrangler add-on installed, so I'm just going to hit shift control and then click to add in our viewer node. Like that, and then we're going to come over here and go into the view layer properties and add some denoising data. This basically just denoises our image and makes it look a little bit nicer. So we're just going to quickly plug in all of these nodes into the correct sockets like that. So now we actually need to composite the video below our actual footage, and so let's come over here, go to movie clip like that, and then we're just gonna bring in our movie clip that we already have in the scene, and then to combine the two, we're just gonna add in a alpha over node and then put these sockets like this. Now let's go ahead and give that a quick little view. So now if I come over here, we can actually see that we have some area on the side where it's not really being rendered, and that's actually because the video footage and the actual render layers aren't the same resolution. And so to change that, we're going to come back to the compositing section. We're going to go ahead and add in a scale node, place that in between our movie clip and alpha over, and then we're going to change this from relative to render size and make sure it's on stretch. One thing I will quickly notice is that the lighting is also off in our scene, and so to change that, we're going to come back to the layout view, go select our light up here, and then I'm just going to increase this a bit. Let's try 3000, and let's see how that looks. Okay, so that is looking much better. Now let's do our final render and compositing. So what we want to do is come over here and make sure that we are satisfied with all of these settings up here. Come over to our output properties, make sure our resolution and frame rate are correct, which they are. Next thing you want to do is make sure your start and end frame are correct. And so then we can actually set a output folder. Since we are going to be rendering in a PNG sequence, so we're going to go ahead and create a new folder. I'm just going to name mine image sequence. And then go ahead and drop those in the folder. We don't need to name it, we can just hit accept. We want it to be on PNG. Make sure that RGBA is turned on, that's very important. And then the compression we can change all the way down to 0. And then finally we want to make sure that the only thing that we're rendering out is actually our 3D viewport with the transparent background for now. So all we want to do is plug in this denoise node into our composite, and then we have everything correctly set up. We can go ahead and render out our animation. Okay guys, here is our result that we got, and we notice that we have a transparent background with our 3D viewport, and it is looking very nice. And so we need to composite this together with our actual video footage, so let's go ahead and do that. First of all, we're just going to come over here, delete our render layers now, because we actually are just going to be rendering the actual image sequence that we just created. We're just going to add in a image node to replace that with, and then we just want to open up wherever we saved our image sequence to. Open that. You will notice that it automatically sets a image sequence down here. Then we can just plug that image into the alpha over. Let's go ahead and give that a view. You might need to check the pre-multiply like that, and then plug the image of the alpha over into the composite. And then the final thing that we want to do is come over here to the render properties and change the color management back to standard instead of fill in. Okay, so now that we are done with that, we can actually come up to the output properties. Everything has been saved, so we just want to save a new file. I'm just going to name mine final render like that, accept that. Then we're going to change the file format to FFmpeg, then MP4, and then change the output quality to high. And now that we have that, we are ready to render the animation again, now with our composite finally composited together correctly, so we can come up here and render the animation. Okay guys, this is the final result we got for this tutorial. I think it turned out pretty good, but let me know how you guys think I did. Any suggestions that you might have, we're all trying to grow, so any help would be greatly appreciated. But anyways guys, we have a Patreon and Discord. Link to those can be found in the description below. Make sure to go join that and like and subscribe for more amazing content in the future. But anyways guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later. Peace.